record this to the cloud. Well, welcome. This is what, week 5 or is it week 6? What is it, Renee? We're really rolling through here. Module 6, I think week 5, right? So we're getting beyond the boring parts of this class and into the active parts of this class. And welcome to Radio 511 on your dial, R511. It sounds like I'm a weekly radio host. I feel like with these guests coming in, fabulous guests, and we have another one right here in front of us who's been tracking this change in the field. What we've basically been doing last week with behaviorism, and this week we move into active learning, just like that, you know. And it should be, as it should be. And you know, I've seen Brent at AECT, Brent Wilson. I've seen him there, but really the time I got to know him best was exactly 10 years ago. Well, exactly, I shouldn't say 10 years ago, 11 years ago. We were in Riyadh together at King Saud University in Riyadh. And, you know, it was delightful to have a chat with him late at night because, you know, we couldn't sleep because we drank the tea that they gave us. And that kept me awake the whole darn night before my plane flew out the next day. I think it kept Brent up as well. They had high octane stuff in there. It was coffee. They called it coffee, but I don't know what it was. It was rocket fuel for all I know. But delightful people. And I think the night we were out on the social, it actually rained in Riyadh. It was a freaky event. Memory serves me well. We also got to a museum and other things. So yeah, it was a pretty interesting time. We were at a hotel that was like 10 miles from the conference. It was not right next door. So we had a long time on the bus ride going over. But apparently a lot has changed in Riyadh since we've been there. Women can drive. Rock and roll concerts happen with men and women don't have to sit in another part of the restaurant to eat or be cordoned off or curtained off. So if we went back today, Brent, maybe we would have the women in the room with us when we presented, because when Brent was presenting his session, I think your session was on transformation of teaching and instruction. You know, if memory serves me right, it has something to do with that. And I can look back on, he sent me his resume and I'm flipping through and I see he's published something. One of his last papers before he retired, well, one of his papers anyhow, not his last one, but he published with my friend George Letsianos. And George almost became my student. He wasn't, but it's a peer-reviewed article about transformation and of learning. And I can't find it in front of me right now, but it was just in front of my face. And he also presented this notion of transformation in Riyadh, if I recall right. And so, I was going to have you talk about your career. You're going to present on your career and all the gaps, but I think it might be kind of interesting to start in an unusual way. Okay. And why don't you talk a bit about, at that point in 2010, why you were interested in transformation and not just incremental changes related to instructional design and technology?
Oh, gosh. Okay, so I'll try to answer in short as I can, but your students, I'm sure, have been introduced to behaviorism and cognitive perspectives on learning and instruction, and so you add, with cognitivism, you add the mind and what might be going on in your head, and constructivism in the 90s was a variation on that, and I became known for some of that work, putting people together in those lines. And then as you push that point, if one of the big ideas that came along as far as people's understanding of learning and instruction was thinking of the learning experience. And the learning experience usually is thought of in cognitive terms, that an experience is something in your head. And I don't think of it that way. I think of an experience as mutually constitutive of the person in their world. So they're engaging the world is pinging them, and they're pinging the world, and it's mutually constructed as they go through things. And so it's not simply a cognitive thing. And so when my team, my research collaborators, my students and I mostly pursued that. We looked at, became interested in deep learning experiences, peak learning experiences, and aesthetics are often defined. Art is often defined as a peak learning experience,
Right.
a heightened or a peak experience. And so we started reading aesthetic literature and philosophy and so forth. And so we kind of drifted toward this idea of an experience that was so deep that it became transformative in your life. So sometimes people begin a class on instruction, they say, hey, tell me about a peak learning experience you had. What kind of instructor really blew your mind and changed your way of thinking that stuck with you forever? And that you can point to and say, this turned me into this field, or this made me think differently about myself. This got me into this mode of thinking. Or I remember them because of their fantastic teaching strategies. And so we started looking at transformative learning experiences defined as experiences that would have a deep and lasting impact on you. And we kind of developed a model for that.
So I found the article or the presentation in Riyadh, and I was listening to the women ask questions. They were the females were in another room, but their presentations knocked your socks off. I wanted to meet them, and so did Brent. Brent talked about transformative learning experiences, strengthening engagement in e-learning courses and programs. That was his keynote talk at the conference. And 2 years early, he wrote with my friend George Felicianos and someone named Parrish, raising the bar for instructional outcomes, how to transformative learning towards transformative learning experiences.
Yeah.
So that is an important, someone need to move in that direction, and it should be maybe the person who got a lot of people together on a book on constructivistic and active learning, which is where I first knew of you, because I bought that book and I made my students buy it later on. A nice light blue book, if I remember right.
That's right. Yes.
You have it on your shelf, by the way, around you?
No. I'm in my home. This is my home office, so I'm good.
So I had to introduce Brent. So Brent he was first at Northern Illinois University, which is not too far from alma mater, Wisconsin and Wisconsin Whitewater. He is an alum of BYU, both his bachelor's and his doctorate. And at some point, I think maybe 1987 or somewhere along the trail of learning, from 1982 to 87, he's in Northern Illinois, which is a big ed tech program.
Yeah.
And then went to University of Colorado, Denver, which is a lovely place, and then has had people, extremely influential people, including Judy Dunlap, who you worked with there, and David Jonathan, and we're going to hear Scott Gravinger. What's that?
Scott Gravinger and Marty Tesmer.
Yeah. And so we'll hear a little bit of stories maybe about maybe David Johnson, who we're going to read from next week. So that'd be kind of a good teaser to introduce you to him, because Scott worked on a book actually with him. And so you've been in a lot of places that are influential within the field. Yeah. Three different places. And you've recently retired. And so are you working on specific projects that you had been putting on hold on the back burner, and now this is your chance to pull off the back burner, or are you doing something totally different?
Yeah, I've kind of backed away, and one of my main reason is because I've developed a retinal condition where I have trouble seeing things clearly, and that makes it hard to read and to fully do my job as a professor, as you can imagine. Now, there are adaptive technologies, but I'm a little too old and set in my ways to totally master that at this point in my career. So I took the opportunity to retire and have backed away. I'm still on a few committees and doing some work, but I'm mostly backed away. And I miss it. I still dream about it. My work is still a big part of me. This means that the invitation is really cool, Kurt, because it gives me an opportunity to come re-engage, and I appreciate that.
Do you know Scott McLeod there at University of Colorado, Denver?
I certainly do. Scott's a great colleague, and it's a huge addition to our program to have him with us.
He started a podcast show with me. He no longer was part of the podcast show, but the first year, first season, we're in season 2 now.
Yeah.
Silver Lining for Learning. So I got to know him. He is very connected and very influential in the K-12 space. You had something prepared for us. Do you want to start with that, or?
Yes, if it's okay. Now, as you've got somebody else coming tonight, right? Scott Graminger
is coming at 7:30 our time, so we've got another 45 minutes or so, or an hour.
Okay, what I'm going to do is kind of take over, if you don't mind, and then pull me back if you feel like, if you are ready for student comments, or I sense it, or if somebody is ready to ask questions, pipe in with questions at any time. But my trouble is I can't see very well, and so I may not notice. Kurt, you may just have to jump in and interrupt me. Is that okay?
Yeah, and Renee can open up the chat. Why don't you post something in the chat so it's open, Renee? And then I've got some questions. I told the students to bring some questions. So at some point, we'll jump into those. So why don't you go ahead and why don't you start, Brent?
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to, let me see here. This is my space, and let me
which one is you?
Yeah, I'll show you. Okay. Now, you got to realize I come out of the Bay Area in the late 60s, and this is my main hero. Does anybody recognize Bob Dylan? And Robbie Robertson's playing guitar behind him, Rick Danko from the band. The reason why they called themselves the band is because they were Dylan's band. Here's a quote from Dylan. He's playing electric music in England, and they expect folk music. And a fan yells out from the crowd, "Traitor!" And Dylan says, "I don't believe you." And that's a legendary interaction between protesting fans and a guy who wanted to be true to what he saw as his art. And then my next little framing quote comes from Neil Young. He's another 60s folk singer. "Heart of gold put me in the middle of the road. Traveling there soon became a bore, so I headed for the ditch." And his next 3 albums are called the Ditch Trilogy. And I love all of those albums, by the way, just as much as I love his earlier music. And then another quote I like comes from Richard Rohr. He's a Catholic priest. And he says, "Prophets, by their very nature, cannot be at the center of any social structure. Rather, they are on the edge of inside. They're not at the middle, but they're on the edge of the inside. They cannot be fully insiders, but they cannot throw rocks from outside either. They must be educated with inside the system, knowing and living the rules before they can critique what is non-essential or not so important." And there's another quote about tempered radicals. I'll skip that one. But I put a picture up. This is a quote that I like a lot. It comes from the father of Juanita Brooks. Juanita Brooks is a Mormon historian who published a groundbreaking book telling the story of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the first 9/11, when more than 100 men, women, and children were slaughtered and killed in central southern Utah. As pioneers came across the Utah landscape, there was a conflict and they were killed. And there was pressure on Juanita not to do her research and tell this story. And she was feeling in need of advice. And her father said, "I'm a cowboy, and I've learned that if I ride," let me close this window first. "If I ride in the herd, I'm lost, totally helpless. One who rides counter to it is trampled and killed. One who only trails behind means little. If you're behind the herd, you're not having any influence because he leaves all responsibility to others. It's the cowboy who rides the edge of the herd, who sings and calls and makes himself heard, who helps direct the course. Happy sounds are generally better than cursing, but there are times when he must maybe swear a little and swing a whip or lariat to round in a stray or turn the leaders. Okay, so you can tell I'm trying to tell a story of people who may not want to be right in the middle of their profession or their field, who sometimes are looking to make an influence on the field in a certain way. Now, I'm known for my work in constructivism, and constructivism, as you may know by now, kind of follows a certain logical line of thinking, and follows in contrast to behaviorism. I see it as more a metaphor or a philosophy than a theory. It's certainly not something you can test like you would have, to disprove a theory or something. But it helps define your identity and says, wait a minute, I may be an ID, but I'm not that kind of ID. I'm not that kind of instructional designer that you might have encountered at this place or that place. I'm a constructivist kind of guy. And that would be true of teachers or designers or whatever. Sometimes the discussion around constructivism could get a little silly, like we each construct our own realities. That kind of talk, and I won't tell you who said that, but it's just not good thinking. It's not good deep thinking about, philosophy and the way the world is. I think of constructivism as being of two kinds, kind of a mechanistic kind. There's an information processing kind of logic to, like the mind is like a computer, and we construct things based on that kind of cognitive processing activity. There's another kind of constructivism that I felt personally more drawn to that emphasizes more the culture and the language and the making of meaning. And Jerome Bruner, who died not too long ago, but he would be an example of somebody that took that second way of thinking about constructivism. I was more that kind of constructivist in my career. I never used that term to describe myself, although I took it very seriously, but it's hard for me to take these isms and attach my identity to it, and so, but I definitely think that it's something that's very interesting and worth studying. So I endorse your review of it in your class.
Brent, in your bio that you sent us, you called yourself a pluralistic pragmatist.
Okay, pluralistic pragmatist.
That's what you called yourself. So,
and that I'll buy that one. That one I can live with. A quick history of the field during my career. I've lived through a lot. This history predates me. I come in around the 70s. But in the 50s, program instruction and teaching machines were used to early technologies of using the logic of a subject matter to teach a subject. And oftentimes that would be based on a behaviorist way of thinking where you had simple right-wrong answers and it led you through a chain of responses. In the 60s, Robert Gagne was known for helping people say, wait a minute, it's not just response like pigeons. There are different kinds of learning. And those learnings can be very simple and associative, or they can be quite complex and problem-oriented. And so he helped differentiate certain conditions in the teaching situation that would lead to different kinds of outcomes from simple to complex. In those years of 60s and 70s, there was a huge emphasis on instructional strategies, thinking that they had the key to successful learning. If we just give students the right strategies, they will learn. Also in the 70s, we thought in terms of systems design. Engineers and systems scientists came up with this. They noticed that systems behave in a certain way. This was a huge breakthrough in the mid-century. And our field followed that way of thinking in thinking of designing systems in terms of certain purposes and certain objectives, and we laid out rational plans to make that happen. In the 80s, cognition really came to the fore, but behaviorism survived in a form that I called, or that could be called performance improvement or human performance support, where you said, in organizations, we're going to make sure that we have some bottom line things we can measure and assess. And we're going to drive our improvement of a system according to those measurable outcomes. That was a form of the behaviorism that survived into the 80s, 90s, and the 21st century. Constructivism began in the early 90s, and along with later in those years, in the 90s, this understanding of chaos theory, complexity theory, emergence, where things came from. They didn't always have to be pre-planned. Sometimes things took shape among many actors, many agents working together. You'd have an emerging phenomena. And that's related to, of course, to web, the onslaught of the web, connectivism you'll learn about, MOOCs, which are very low cost or free learning classes online. There's different kinds, but that you'll learn about that if you haven't already. But and the idea of the learning experience became prominent at that time. And also, I just arbitrarily almost put it in the 2010s, more of an emphasis on new media. So if you think of activities, why not just get people designing their own interactions? Social media, let people put up their own videos, put up their own podcasts, and have where participants are empowered to control their own learning and share their own stuff with each other. In the 1920s, it's a question of where we might be going so far. But I would guess, because of our experience with COVID lockdowns and so forth, that we might be ready and interested in looking at flexible learning models that integrate and combine online experiences with in-person, how to do that in the very best way. CRT, critical race theory, has become a political controversy. And before that, it was in my department, in my school of education, it was standard fare. It was non-controversial. It was progressive, but it was not a controversial issue. But it acknowledged that power affects how we think. Privilege, power, and how that's perpetuated across our structures and our systems and our institutions, that's interesting, and that's important for our field, just as it's important for education and any kind of understanding of human activity. And social discontents that our country is so divided. I see that continuing. And rather than saying that's an obstacle to my study, that's an obstacle to my understanding of the field, it's a part of our world that needs to be understood as it relates to how we teach, as it relates to how we develop solutions in our field. So,
Great. Can
yeah.
I stop for just a
Yeah,
second?
please. Yeah.
Your overview is exactly this class. So
Yeah.
we will get to performance improvement around week 11 or 12.
Yeah.
We will get to constructivism in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And we remember, if you students Collis's work on flexible learning, we talked about in week 1. I don't know if you know Betty Collis or not in the Netherlands.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Lovely person, and MOOCs is my research area, so you will hear about that too.
Yeah, exactly.
All these areas, this is a precursor to some things, and it's a reflection back on some things already covered, like such as the ADDIE model, and
just because I placed something in one decade doesn't mean that it's irrelevant now. These things have layers and build on each other and have continuing lives. So, and I know that's more than you can handle as a class, but it does give you a tease of all the things I've been through, starting with the 70s. I personally lived through all these things. Okay, and that, if there's a lesson there, It's whatever your training is as a master's student or as a doctoral student, or whatever you do your dissertation on, be prepared to reinvent yourself 2 or 3 times minimum in your career to adapt, in our field particularly, to adapt to new conditions and new technologies, new tools, new empowering tools that become available to you. Not just the tools will shape you in your profession, but also the associated ideas that become important. You say, how could we have neglected that all these years? And you can be expecting your careers to go through similar waves of important ideas. Okay, so one activity I thought of, and I think I won't do it, but I will touch on it, is to try to deconstruct or break down my best definition of the field, and the terms I use is learning, design, and technology, LDT. And so I use those terms. And so learning, what is learning? It's so axiological. It's so primitive in our thinking that we don't often try to define it. It's probably best that we not try too often. But I think of learning as change over time. But it's not kind of the change over time that just happens from maturation, from simple development of, like physical development. It's environment enabled change over time, or environment induced. It happens because we're interacting with the environment, and instruction happens when that's guided and facilitated by some kind of responsible system. Design, the top bullet, can you see there where it says rational planning?
Yep.
That's what we usually think when we think of design. We've gotten some goals. How are we going to get those goals accomplished? I call it rational planning. That is where we start when we think about design. But if you talk to any designer in any field, absolutely, industrial design, graphic design, planning based, where you work from objectives, is almost irrelevant. Or it's a starting point, but there's so many other ways to think about good design that rational design is only a starting place. And then, of course, there's all kinds of other ways, fruitful ideas associated with design. If you get into this field, you're going to explore some of the nuances of what good design is, or what productive or fruitful design is. And it takes you far, far beyond that kind of logical, left-brained, rational planning to all kinds of other notions. And some are very creative, drawing on aesthetics and drawing on the artistic side of design. Others are more distributed, where the participants themselves become critical players in that design, and so forth. Well, the last term of my field, LDT, is technology. And of course, what usually comes to mind in the popular imagination is the plug-in hardware that we all depend on so much. Chargeable plug-in devices. But resources, artifacts, procedures. Sometimes procedures are called soft technologies because they're not the hardware, but they're critical parts of our managing the world to develop procedures and models to help us manage the world. We often think of technology as value neutral. It can be put to good uses, bad uses. It's like a value carrier. I like to go beyond that notion of value neutral or even value carriers by engaging humans. Humans and technologies co-engage and develop value. We create value. We create ourselves. We create our identities through our interactions with technology. And so that's some of the ideas you may encounter in your program.
Brent, can you scroll back up
Sure.
briefly? We had
Yeah.
maker labs up there that were above the technology, the design part.
Yes. Maker
Maker
spaces.
labs, this seems to be the big part that's in a huge flux right now, or change right now.
Yes.
And many departments are changing their name to learning, design, and technology.
Yes.
Hawaii, Houston,
That's right.
Purdue, Wayne
I
State,
think Georgia.
Georgia. We
Yeah.
did not at Indiana yet. I'm trying to get us to,
Yeah.
but at this point, I think, or maybe in the technology part, Kevin had a question for you. So Kevin, you want to
Okay.
jump in and ask him a question? You might be muted, Kevin.
Okay, how's that?
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here with us today. So as you were speaking, it made me wonder a little bit as we look at designing things for the designing learning for the general population, so to speak.
Yes.
I am not in education, I'm in business. And so we are not on the cutting edge of instructional design, so to speak, because our participants aren't there mentally. You know, they're on a different plane.
Yeah.
So my question is it more effective as an instructional designer to be looking forward to upcoming trends in learning science, or do you try to stay as current as possible with what is going on around you, or is it better, as I look at what I'm doing, to actually use some of the older ideas that more of the participants would be familiar with?
Okay. It's Kevin, right?
Yes.
Kevin, that's a great question. It gives me an opportunity to emphasize a couple of things. First, some career advice. Think about who you are and what you bring to the table when you start a graduate program. You're going to bring those same things to the table when you conclude a graduate program and you're trying to compete for a job. So the chances are good that you'll have an advantage when you apply to a job that's business related. You may not have the advantage in a K-12 setting or in a health delivery setting or in a government setting quite as much. See what I'm saying? So or an IT setting, technology, where technology might be the dominant thing. You bring certain skills and advantage because of your experience and your skill set, and you're going to hold on to those. But that doesn't mean you forget those as you go through the program. What you should be doing as you go through the program is constantly looking and thinking about which of these ideas, Brent, for example, has thrown out a bunch of these things. Well, what of it piques my interest as a business person? If I'm in a training situation in a business setting, which of these ideas seem to be fruitful for me? If we talk about open learning, and I'm in a very closed kind of environment where very proprietary ownership is top on the list, that creates a conflict. And how do I want to respond to the conflict? Am I going to be a champion for openness and open sharing and collaboration and fight the institution, or fight that value or contest that value? Or am I going to say, no, that open stuff, that's not really quite so relevant for me. I'm going to hold back and not try to push and use that as my key, how I configure my key toolbox. See what I'm saying? So I think that in making that answer, I kind of try to give you an answer to how I think about, what to do with these different ideas that you're going to encounter in your program. There are going to be some things that really resonate. If I talk about accounting and and assessment, maybe there's some real things that'll be able to take shape and hold in your mind. And they say, oh, accounting is telling a story. In Latin, it means telling a story. Contar. If anybody speaks Spanish or Italian or something, you would know that cuento or contar is key to accounting. Accounting is not just numbers and columns and formulas. Accounting is making an accounting of myself. And maybe that's fruitful for you and your situation in your work situation. But you'll be able to find things, no matter what your background, that connect to what we're doing in our field. The other point to make about this is that you may think that the knowledge generated in our field comes only from refereed journals where people collect data on subjects and report those statistics. That's one kind of knowledge that's generated in our field. But the other kind of knowledge is the settings and the literatures that are out there in nursing and in business and in IT and in healthcare, that people are doing interesting practice. They're doing interesting work, and they've got a literature, they've got a history, they've got some norms and values that they use. And the sharing of those different perspectives in both formal and informal sharing also generates knowledge. And so think of, knowledge, and think of our field very broadly. I like to think of it as like an open tent. It's a big tent, and you will find a place within that as well.
So Brent,
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Kevin, you didn't say where you work at the company.
I actually work for an international dental research journal, so I'm in publishing.
Yeah, and publishing is going under all kinds of convulsions. And one interesting convulsion is, what is knowledge from an academic point of view? Is knowledge what the experts cite of each other? If I publish a paper and Kurt cites that paper in his paper, does that make me influential? That's one kind of index of value of scholarly output. Another kind of scholarly output is, if I publish a paper and somebody in Brazil, the prime minister of culture in Brazil, uses my idea and develops some new program to serve people in their education department or in their, that's another kind of influence that we need better metrics for even figuring out what is good scholarship in our field and how to measure it, how to reward it.
I completely agree.
Good, thank you.
Thanks for the story about stories. Because I used to be an accountant, so now I know why I like to tell stories.
That's right. Kurt is an inventor he's a master storyteller. So, okay, well, technology we've talked about. If you do a similar kind of breakdown for IST, like Indiana's, I think that's the name of your program, Kurt. It's a similar, and IST has this huge historical framework, but instruction, I'll tell you why I finally gave up on that term a little bit, is because it doesn't translate well into other languages and cultures. There are some cultures where it's thought to be too directing and controlling and didactic. And so as valuable as it is, and I think as a term, instructional designer still is a dominant name for what designers do, it may have a sunset at some point. Systems, the term arose in our field when people thought about system in closed terms, of like these purpose or objective driven systems to accomplish things and so forth. And now in recent 20 or 30 years, the open type of system that is more loosely coupled, individual agents interacting in interesting ways, that kind of system has taken hold, and we realize how important that is. That means that the new way of thinking about systems is adaptable. We can use that term still and have meaningful conversations about that. But you'll learn maybe a little bit more about those issues later in the course or in the program. And then the technology we've talked about. So that's enough for now. Is there any points? This is a natural break for any questions people may have.
Anyone want to jump in with questions? I've got a few, but I'm go last. So I want to make sure the students go first before me.
Yes, because I've got what might be a game, but we may not end up having a game because we don't have enough time or space, or But let me tell you a possible game we could play. I wish we could play. We would do a flipping binaries game, where we would take a binary like theory and practice, and we would say usually the one gets all the attention. Let's flip it and see what happens. See what I'm saying? So that I'm not sure that makes sense to you yet, but let me tell you, for example, science versus art. We have our humanities fields and we have our science fields. In a university, guess which of those two departments, let's just call them departments, guess which of those two departments gets all the funding and all the better, newer buildings and all the money? Science or art?
Science.
Of course. And art, people are not, they're not choosing art degrees, they're choosing science degrees or science and technology degrees. Well, if we wanted to, and of course our field is reflects that. So the lion's share of attention in our field goes to technical, quantitative, objective ways of thinking about our work. And the research dollars, the funding of programs and so forth tends to be dominated by the science and technology side as opposed to the humanities side. And that's probably good for the field because we need to build buildings and we need to have programs and we need to have funded research. But that doesn't mean that the humanities side of thinking of things has no value. In fact, maybe it has a latent value that if you go too far down the one side, you may get in trouble. Your theories may be lacking. Your understanding of practice may be lacking because you're pushing one side too far and not giving enough space and voice to the other side. You see what I'm saying? And so I like to look for tensions and then think of the field as the tensions are good. The tensions are totally awesome. And what I like to do is pay attention to the less dominant side, to the recessive or the hidden or the silent side, the ones whose voices are not so strong in the field. And I like to say, what's going on over there? We could maybe improve our constructive whole thinking about what it means to be human.
Brent, this brings up a question I had on my
Sure.
list.
Yeah.
BYU Magazine called you a loyal maverick.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
What do they mean by that? Did you win an award or an alumni award?
Yes, I got an alum award, and that was an article written about me for their alums or for their students or something. And I think in those similar ways, I try to frame a similar identity to myself as somebody on the edge of insight. So I'm a member of the field, but I'm also a wandering member. I like to go looking around for ideas outside of my field. I'm not square in the middle of the club. And so at AECT or AERA, I had my opportunities for leadership and for influence as far as being right in the middle. But then I said, my true interests lie around the sides. And so I went looking around the sides. And so I that's how I explained to this journalist I talked to, and she wrote that article.
And another follow-up on that.
Yeah.
Your book on constructivist learning environments, case studies and instructional designs,
yeah,
was highly influential to me, my students, and many others.
Okay.
What were the reasons for its success? Would you say it's something that was on the edge at the time? It wasn't embraced in the middle? It was as an example of where you were at the time?
Yeah, I'll give you a sense for that. I think the movement to constructivism in the early 90s was hugely exciting and transformative for my own thinking, my own career. And that's because I've been waiting in my career in the 80s and 70s. I was waiting for more attention to the meaning making, and I guess you could say the soft side of our field. And it wasn't very prominent because behaviorism and the hard-nosed kind of information processing dominated, even with the entry of cognitivism, which I was instrumental in helping happen in our field. But I was still waiting for more. When constructivism hit, it gave me a little bit of an invitation to go looking more directly for that soft side. And so that's why that book or that movement, it was a moment. I don't think my book was so important as the moment to our field.
Right.
And what that the influence it had on our field was just this acknowledgement that, hey, life is complex. The full human, if you're going to look at a human being, we are more than just our, our objective choices and descriptions. We have this something going on in us, but even then, when you go in, it's just not boxes and arrows inside. There's something else going on, and so that was kind of, I think that time was important in our field of the development of constructivism and what that opened up. So I think I can be done presenting. What I'll do is these notes, I'll send you a link, and we can talk a little bit more about methods and so forth. But you've got the idea. I think it's enough for our purposes to get this idea of, and let me just stop sharing. And maybe open it up to more questions, opportunities for people just to interact or ask questions. There's a lot of new stuff I throw out, especially for beginning weeks of a class, of an introductory class. But it's good, I think, to look at some of these big picture questions as you approach a field, because then it gives you an invitation to hook on your understanding, your best. What are you good at? What are you strong at? Where is your experience base? Where are your inclinations? And then connect that way to these things that you'll be learning.
I'm going to open up to anyone, but I want to point out Millie, who was my international scholar the last couple of years, went back to China recently, and I haven't heard from her, and I sent her an invite. I'm glad she's shown up here tonight from China. Millie, do you have any questions for Dr. Wilson to start us off here? And you're muted, Millie. At least you should say hi.
Hi. Sorry, I just got have a little bit mess, so I couldn't open the video.
Oh,
yeah,
that's fine.
You have a question?
I have no question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, Millie. Thank you for coming. It's great to have everybody here. Appreciate those who have joined live, and I imagine there will be people coming in after also.
Yeah, so half of them are going to be probably watching the videos. They have an option here at IU, the school. We can't require the synchronous, so they have an option.
I approve that. I would never want to require this kind of set time. So,
Nelson, let's go to you.
Yeah, sure. When you were doing your research in the field, when you first started your PhD programs, how did you decide what would be your research focus?
Okay. Yeah. Here's a story I've thought about sometimes. I told you I was immersed in a world that was obsessed with instructional strategies, and I helped actually. If you could talk to Dave Merrill and say who helped you into the cognitive world, he would say Brent Wilson, because I got very enthusiastic about a new wave of looking at psychology, which was my undergraduate area, and cognition was an alternative to the behavioral tradition of both how I was trained in psychology, but also how he was trained, my mentor. And at a doctoral level, you work very closely with all your professors, but especially this one, your one advisor, your one person. And so, what I would look, if you're a doctoral student, look for the new thing that you can bring to your professor. Look for the new expertise that you have, or that you're tracking research, you're following literature more deeply than your professor is. And that you can say, hey, look, this is an area that's happening. This is very important to our field. And I'll be your guide into this new area. I'll be your point person. I was that in the area of cognition for Dave Merrill. Dave left my university. He didn't get to continue as my advisor. But I continued my own kind of wrestling around for cool ideas. And at that time, I became interested in evaluation. Program evaluation in the 70s was a big, important item. And At that time, qualitative evaluation was brand new. The idea of measuring something by talking to people and getting their response, or doing a open-ended survey where they could tell all their thoughts and you could have some means of measuring that, pulling meaning out of that response. That was new, qualitative. It's funny now because it's so commonplace, but in those days it was new. And I remember thinking, how much of a maverick do I want to be? How much of a trailblazer do I want to be? Do I want to fight this fight? Is this the cause that I want to plant my flag on and just make it everything? And because I'm convinced it's important, maybe I can be in there in a key conversation about a new idea. And I did not take that option. I said, qualitative evaluation, that's cool. It's really got promise and there's cool things to be done and to promote but I just decided it wasn't my fight. It wasn't my particular passion. But then I thought, and then in ensuing years, I see how our understanding of human beings changed. And I said, oh, look, we corrected. We become more complete in our understanding of what it means to be human. It's not just about numbers and columns of data, but it's this other stuff too. That's all good. We've got a better understanding. I could have been there to make more of an impact on the field, but I chose not to because it would be too hard a battle to fight with my people, or I'm not sure I had the interest or the passion that would get me to really be that person that could promote it. So that's not a total answer to your question, but it is a connecting of your question to my experience. You have to have something that you feel you're excited about. Certainly, you feel like the field could be benefited from more attention to this side of things or this question. But then you also have to think: is this the right time? Do I have the right resources? Do I have the right backing? To make this happen.
I'm going to add to that,
Thank
and
you.
that you're finding an area that you can help your professor learn. For me, I'm on a lot of language education dissertations right now, and Renee's one of them. My dissertation was computers and writing, so they're helping me learn the newer stuff that's come out and get the newer articles and so forth. So I know a lot about the field, but it's keeping up to date. It's really important in the field. And we've got one of the top language education programs in the world, or at least in the country. So
that's
we
great.
have some top people in that, and they overlap many with IST. So even better, like Renee's got a master's in IST, and a master's in about 5 other subjects, plus her dissertation in language.
Yeah, let me throw one more thing out. I don't know who else might have a question, but let me throw one more thing out. I teach in the middle of downtown Denver, Colorado. All right, that was where my career was. I retired last year, and that's an urban school of education. It's an urban university. It's more diverse, and it's closer to people who work full time than, let's say, Boulder, the same university system. And it's just Boulder campus is 30 miles away, but my campus is right in the middle of things and right in the middle of a more diverse urban community. That means, I think largely because of that situatedness, that location, our place in the world, in the physical world, we were more tuned in to diverse student needs as a school of education. So if we're looking at schools, we'd be trying to address those kinds of problems. And we took on values and models and ways of thinking appropriate to those problems. And in that way, we were a little ahead of other schools that maybe are a lot of white male faces in your classes, teaching your classes. Or thinking about problems in a more traditional way of science going to solve all your, has all the answers to your needs and so forth. And so it broke out, you were forced to break out and anticipate some of the societal trends of diversity, inclusion, and equity that we certainly face now, and that we're welcome, we're excited to be addressing. Well, my urban school took an earlier look at that than some other schools. And I was ready because I'm always looking out there. I was kind of interested in those movements and those changes and those things happening. And when it came to looking at AECT, my professional organization, I noticed that there wasn't nearly as much as I wish there were, or as there could have been, in addressed to those specific questions. There was a division of international. There's an international division. And that could mean a lot of things. And a lot of times it was a little bit of a ghetto for people from a certain country just get together and support each other. And I call ghetto because it's separated from it wasn't well woven or well connected into everything else that happened. It's more siloed. I guess silo is a better word. And so a few years ago, not too many years ago, that division kind of morphed into a culture, division, culture, learning, and technology division that now is fertile ground for giving space, giving conference attention. If you submit a proposal related to culture and so forth, you've got a good, healthy space, and it allows for good theoretical frameworks. Good, if you're going to push some values and so forth, you've got a place to do that.
Brent, we've got a question here from Renee. We need to,
Yeah.
and I've got a couple more.
Sure.
And I just want to point out that Colorado, Denver to Boulder is sort of like IUPUI, Indiana University to Bloomington, kind of like Wayne State to Michigan. So is this,
exactly.
They're 30 miles away. We're 60 miles from IUPUI, 55. So very similar though.
Yes, and very often, if you look at power differential, very often the urban centers are thought to be, oh, that's just a commuter school. That's where people go to take one or two classes. The real people who are doing deep and heavy research go to this residential program with the Ivy Leagues, the IVs on the buildings. And there can sometimes be a power differential between practitioner-oriented programs and more prestigious programs. Flip those binaries, flip those power relations, and look at what your commuter school has to offer you. That can be a good technique for advancing your field.
Especially today, with diversity, equity, and inclusion prominent in every conversation. Renee, you've got a long question. You want to ask them?
I guess my question essentially, I was thinking I think you have a really vast interest in different subjects related to learning and teaching. So how do you cultivate your identities, your multiple identities, and to make sure you don't lose them, or how do you bring them together and without having a identity crisis?
Okay, that's good. That's a really good question. A few years ago, I wrote a paper with a doctoral student on this kind of question, identities within our field and so forth. I like the plural. I'm just into the plural. So Renee, I'm sure you're passionately interested in language learning, and in our field also, and I'm sure I'm not done with that list. There are other things. In my case, I'm a Christian. Well, being a Christian, and in my case, I'm a Mormon, that informs who I am, and I'm not a good compartmentalizer. So I'm not just one thing or the other, I'm multiple things. And sometimes it does get messy, because I'm talking to one audience, you don't know what the heck I'm talking about because I got this from some other place. You have to bring a light. You bring your light. It's like a hero's quest. You go out and have your adventure, but then you bring back your findings, your treasure, bring it back to your community and say, look what I found. This applies not just to language learning. This applies to, it's a powerful concept. Language people got it because it's obvious there, but it extends to this place and that place, and you can bring it to them and help, they can benefit. So I like the plurality, but the sense of holistic you know, that sense of integration in your own self, yeah, that has to come from you. You have to do that work. And but you get over the anxiety of expecting to be just one thing. You say, I'm not one thing. The best scholars among us have multiple connections, multiple identities, multiple groups, tribes, people that we, you know, that we connect to. If you are so fully into this field of learning and technology that you got no friends anywhere else, I feel sorry for you. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I feel sorry for you because this world is vast and fascinating and interesting, and you're going to run into people with conflicting views, and that's good. And you can manage it in some way, in whatever fashion you can pull it together. So I hope that, you know,
Yeah, thank you.
sure.
I was just grabbing a book off my shelf. Even in summer, the ice doesn't melt. Constructive Living, the Japanese Way Through Morita and Nakan Therapies by David Reynolds.
Fascinating.
I opened a page or two today, or maybe it was this morning. And exactly that notion of multiple identities was the page that I was reading about.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, another person, Margaret Mead married Gregory Bateson. They were two anthropologists in the mid 20th century. Their daughter, Catherine Bateson, wrote a book called Composing a Life. And you can imagine just the title of that book,
Yeah.
Composing a Life. You've got one life to live, and it's a creative endeavor. Talk about design. If we're designers, we're, you know, design thinking, we are designing our lives. And part of that design of our life is to pull these disparate elements together, not to think, oh, we're just one silo or the other, and then think, maybe these people have an interest in hearing something that I learned from this other place. And that's what makes it all fun, is that porousness.
So I have a couple of questions that relate to upcoming people. And the first question is going to be just about you. But as I think about it, it has to do also with my guest next Sunday. I'm having Tom Reeves from Georgia come in, along with Ron Oliver, his colleague in Australia, who's got a book on authentic online learning. And Ron was real prominent in online learning space for a long time, but then became a dean, and we never heard from him much anymore, as what happens to all administrators. But he's going to come in on Sunday morning. But I was going to ask you this question about what is authentic learning, and can you measure it? But or do we not want to measure it? Because it's been your area for a long time.
Remember, you can come to me for some sideways opinions or a flipped opinion.
Uh-huh.
And so authenticity, because authenticity arose, that kind of talk arose in that constructivist era. And so authentic is trying to get at the real. And the real suggests that there's something behind the externals, you know, and so forth. And the real Brent, who is the real Brent? Well, that pushes us towards kind of an essentialist way of thinking about me. I'm some fixed entity. Inside me is this little box of the real thing, and it has to be true to this little thing of me. Well, that's a construction. It's a myth. You know, in more or less in short terms, yeah, there's Brent, but you can't get at anything real. So if you're going after authenticity, don't take it too literally. The quest is great. You try to find something that feels honest, and you know, we kind of all know what authentic means, but don't take it too seriously, because there is no real you. There is no, and it's a constructed self. It's a constructed identity, and it's a constructed idea of what authentic might mean. So if it makes sense and works in the world, that's good enough, you know, for me. That would be true of authentic learning too.
Okay, my other question that relates to someone who's coming in, we're going to have Scott's going to come next after break, and you wrote a book with him back in 1990, along with David Jonathan, a book on building expert systems for education and training.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was 30 years back. Have you monitored the field because recently AI in education has taken a more prominent role.
Yes.
There was a lot of promise back in the mid 80s. There was a lot of promise. I know because I was tracking it a bit. I was going to major in it at Wisconsin in
Yeah.
AI. And then I saw people taking too long to graduate. I said, I'm not going to go there.
Yeah.
But there was a lot overpromised in the 80s and 90s.
There
and
definitely was.
underdelivered. And then now all of a sudden it's starting to make an impact. Just like ebooks were overpromised, and then all of a sudden ebooks, there was a tipping point that happened, and people, ebooks became front and center.
Yes.
Same
I'll try to tell this in a story that's consistent with what I've been saying. In the 70s and 80s, not only computer science was relatively new, but they thought they could turn cognition into, the machines could help us understand cognition. They approached it largely in terms of rules, if-then rules.
Right.
And we called them expert systems. And we had logic of various rules that could guide you and give you some direction. Well, there were promoters of that at MIT and various universities. There was also a critic of that. He was from Berkeley. His name was Hubert Dreyfus.
Right.
He was a philosopher, not a tech guy, not a quantitative guy. He was a philosopher, a follower of continental philosophy, people like Martin Heidegger, and other continental philosophers. And he said, wait, this project you've got is mistaken. That's not how people are. People are not rule driven. They are not, you can try all day to create a rule-based system. It's never going to solve problems like humans do. And the AI people like Seymour Papert were so mad at him, they wouldn't appear on television program with him. And they were just enemies, just bitter enemies. Well, Hubert Dreyfus was right. And a rule-based or logical left-brained way to try to understand human intelligence is doomed to failure. And so what we have in our era is using large data sets and looking for patterns and looking for relationships in these large data sets where we get around the rule question. We don't try to solve it with a rule. We try to solve it by comparison, by similarity, by pattern matching, and it does work a lot better. The trouble with our current way of thinking about AI solutions is that it's pretty much black box. We depend on these large data sets, and then you say, well, why do you have to be female? Why do you have to be male to be a computer scientist? I don't know. That's just the way the resumes, we took millions of resumes and found out that you have to be male. Well, and then you say, but that conflicts with my values. You say, well, it's just based on all these, I can't explain it. It's just based on all this data that we fed into it. It's black box. It's opaque. There's no explanation. And so for certain kinds of problems that we monitor carefully and control and apply we do our normal checks and balances to make sure we're not doing harm on the world. We can apply these AI techniques, but then we have to be sure that our values and our good intentions are preserved when we use these AI solutions.
So 2 questions before we take a break, because we need to have some break between you and Scott. And I want to ask you a question about Scott, but I first going to ask you a question about David Jonasson.
Yeah.
We had Marcy Driscoll as a guest last spring, and I was able to ask her questions about Robert Gagne, and she gave it and she's done talks at conferences for AECT. And if you go to AECT Legends and Legacy videos, you could see Marcy interviewed about Gagne. Yeah. So and it's fascinating. So I know we don't have time for all that you know about David Jonasson, but could you shed some light on maybe tell a story or tell how the 2 of you worked together on different projects or team taught a course together? Because we're going to read from
Okay. So in 1981 or 80 or 81, Jonasson was hired to the Denver campus of University of Colorado to build a program in educational technology. And the next year I was brought on. When he came, there was a half-time person there, Marty Tesmer, who was an instructional designer for the library. The very next year, Dave hired me and Scott Grabinger to join the
Uh-huh.
faculty. And we joined him, and my office had a window, and just outside my door, was his office. So I had opened my door, and his office would be right next to mine. And Dave had tremendous energy. He was educated at a non-primary school, like you'd mentioned, Kurt. Your degree was from where?
Which one?
Oh, your PhD.
PhD Wisconsin. It was
Okay.
UW.
Well,
Yeah.
okay. Wisconsin was, yeah. So Dave's PhD was from Temple, and that wasn't one of your big powerhouse ID schools.
Right.
And he came in with a huge appreciation for Gagné and Merrill and the kind of path-breaking work they had done in differentiated different kinds of learning outcomes and applying it to practical problems. But he was another carrier of cognitivism into our field. We were very strategy-centric. And he said, oh, strategy is huge, but let's look at cognitive structure. Let's look at cognitive processing. And he took that attitude and led that move towards cognitivism in our field in the 80s and 90s. And then in his careers, and another thing I loved about Dave Jonasson is that he would interact and engage anybody. He'd go to a conference of APA, psychologists, pure psychologists. And he didn't have a psychologist degree, but he went there, talked to people who taught educational psychology, and he would, publish papers and work on things with anybody in any program, in any department. He'd collaborate with them and try to apply his best knowledge, marry it with what they knew, and come up with something. So I admired him a lot.
Yeah, David, I was the first faculty member I wrote to when I was a grad student. My first semester, first month leaving the field of accounting, and I wrote a pen and paper letter, and he responded to Denver. He was in Denver at the time, and he wrote me back. And then later on, we became friends, and I wrote a nomination letter for him to become a curator professor at Missouri, then and named professor there. I went from being a junior person to being someone who was established enough to be able to write a letter from. So I think we became friends. He was a great guy.
He really was. He's amazing.
He was an amazing mind that he had.
Absolutely.
If anyone gets a chance who's watching the recording later, read anything from David Johnson, computers as kind of tools in particular. Mind tools in particular, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. And problem solving,
in problem solving and constructivism and so forth. You just name it. So I had a book on his on knowledge structures, or how to evaluate knowledge structures through concept maps, order tree analysis, all these different
I remember that.
pathfinders and all these ways. So now Scott's going to pop it in here in a couple of minutes. If you were asking him questions, what would be one or two things that we could ask him about that he'd be surprised that we would ask him about?
Mm-hmm.
What topics would be good to ask him about in terms of his career or in terms of his impact that would be a good conversational starter?
One thing that might be interesting. Scott got an EDD from Indiana,
Right?
And they offered a PhD, as I recall, and he had an EDD, and we teased him, but he was good with media. He was good with slides and artistic side. And when we were in meetings, he's an introvert, and he would love to doodle. While he's listening, he would love to doodle and make little patterns. Not figures, but patterns, like Paisley type patterns. He would make patterns on paper. And that was his way of processing, being somehow engaged, like knitting, while he's listening and not necessarily saying a lot. And I've always wondered about the artistic side of Scott. I've wondered about the media and the artistic side of him, because he shows a lot of left brain in his career. And
so are you an artist would be a good question.
Yeah. What's the artist?
And he's a travel guide now in Italy.
Exactly. And so you look at his career now, doing that kind of photography and tourism and things like that. I can see of that art side coming forward. I'd like to see how he integrates that and sees that as it relates to the field now.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you for your time here tonight, or this afternoon in Colorado. Have a great end of your Monday there. And I really appreciate you coming in. And, I'll be contacting you again in the future. I'll share a few things about this class as we move through the rest of the semester. There's a couple of things I didn't get to ask you that I might pose on the side via email and see what you have to say. I hope that your eyesight can, somebody can find some magic pill that can help
No,
in the near future.
I've adjusted to life, but I really appreciate the invitation, and I hope the students in your class appreciate how your attitude towards the field is reflected in how you teach, and how that can be something they take with them, not just the material that they learn in class, but the modeling of you as a person, and then thinking about how they can apply that in their work as well. So
thank you. Thank you very much, Brent. And I'm going to stop the recording, but I'm going to leave the camera on and everything. So at this point, I want you all to give a round of applause, and I'm going to stop